Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Imagine Dragons called Evolve. So here's a question that you never want to ask yourself after confronting a mediocre run for a band. Were they ever that good to begin with? It's a terrible thing to ask, because you're now questioning old opinions and old reviews placed in hindsight, where yes, history can definitely color how you see them and the art now. Maybe not entirely. It's not like I can ever revisit the first albums by the Strokes knowing the downward slide they weren't going to face. I still like that first album, but you get that faint pang of regret in the sense that there could have been so much more to these bands, and no band has ever epitomized that for me in the mainstream more than Imagine Dragons. Let me make this very clear. While their debut, Night Visions, it had its issues, the great songs on it were amazingly good, and it reflected a sound and direction for a modern rock band that, had some potential. Blending in elements of folk with some indie rock smolder and electronic rock punch, it was enough for me to bypass how the production could feel, a little monochromatic, courtesy of Alex the Kid, and the lyrics could feel a tad flimsy and overwrought. But hey, it kind of fit right for arena rock, given Dan Reynolds as a frontman. Well, fast forward to 2015 and Smoke and Mirrors, a record that reflected nothing more than a band cycling through ideas and trying to ram them through their established framework. Many people, including myself, called it something of a sophomore slump, and considering how badly it did on the charts, especially with the singles with no real sustainable crossover, I pretty much thought that Imagine Dragons may have just been out for the count, especially as they announced their own hiatus. And yet, they rescinded that, and going into Evolve, it seems like Imagine Dragons might actually have regained some actual momentum in the mainstream, pushing their frustrating producer, Alex the Kid, to the sidelines for the majority of this album, and instead churning out a tight set of 11 tracks. And while I had no real expectations that this would be great, critics, if anything, have been even harder on this project than Smoke and Mirrors, which kind of blew my mind. You all still wanted me to cover it, so it finally got to the top of the schedule on Patreon. So what did we get from Evolve? Well, honestly, I think after entirely too many listens through this album, I completely get why this has not exactly been getting a lot of attention beyond the singles. Because while I have been forgiving of Imagine Dragons in the past, or at least willing to say that there was more going on for the band, that they weren't really a boring group, I can't really say that this time around. There's a little bit more consistency in the production on Evolve, I'll give them that, but when you consider how the writing seems to have taken a sharp dip towards generic platitudes, you start realizing how much of a slog this album is, and it really doesn't have that long of a run time to be that. It's got enough moments that are tolerable that will save it from a failing grade, but only barely, because I don't really consider this a good album. And I think a big part of this is that Dan Reynolds finally seemed to get a little bit more of a handle on his vocal delivery this time around. That's one of the things that saved it, mostly staying away from the falsetto and high notes that don't really fit his more raw, belting voice. And yes, I've heard Believer, I said mostly here. And leveraging his multi-tracking, he does it pretty effectively. I'll be the first to say that I'm actually a fan of Dan Reynolds as a singer, as he's got a huge range and real stage presence, to the point where you can definitely wish he had a bit of a meteor rock guitar or a real bass line behind him. And yes, we'll get to this a little bit more in a second, but I think the pressing issue here is that his vocal production continues to just not flatter him nearly as much as it should, or rather just inconsistency this time around. By far the worst examples are Yesterday and Dancing in the Dark, the closer, which are both bad songs not helped by the shifting, muddy fidelity of the vocal pickup that no extra pitch-shifted crooning can effectively fix. It just becomes a runny mess, which might as well apply to a lot of the production too, to be honest. And while I've tended to be a bit more forgiving of Imagine Dragons than most other bands when it comes to emphasizing percussion over melody, those big, thunderous beats, they've always been one of the biggest selling points for this group, along with the wheedling guitars that are kind of U2-esque, and a stubborn lack of real groove, which kind of is not U2-esque, or wish you had that. But it was Evolve that showed me why it just doesn't work for me on this album. The blending. All the more pronounced here with mixes that are more spacious and reverb touch than normal. If you pay attention to much of the synthetic beats or the percussion near the front, not only are they at the very front of the mix overpowering everything, the actual percussion sound doesn't expand throughout the mix, but instead feels confined to the front and feels increasingly inorganic, and it also doesn't build any sort of potential synergy with the melody. It doesn't build any groove. Granted, the guitar melodies here are pretty frail as it is, most often in muted acoustics or a few liquid electric tones tones, mostly de-emphasized in favor of bigger, blockier synths that seem imported from your average 80s rock tune that you've already forgotten about. And sure, it's a fine stylistic flourish for indie rock, I can kinda get behind that. But not only are Imagine Dragons heading into oversaturated territory with lots of other bands doing this sound better, it's hard not to feel like they're bringing anything new to the sound. Hell, the opening track, I don't know why, sounds like a leftover from The Weeknd of all people, and it's another reason why songs like I'll Make It Up to You and Start Over and Dancing in the Dark feel so forgettable. At least the 80s rock and metal that I like and remember allowed a guitar solo with real shred behind it, not just a few notes. Now, it's not just saying that Imagine Dragons can't bring some decent swell. Whatever It Takes actually has some muscle on the low end for once, as does Mount the River with some noisier percussion. It feels a little bit more like a rock song. And even if Walking the Wire feels depressingly conventional in the composition, really a lot of this album does, it feels like a decent pop rock song, which I think is a more promising direction than Imagine Dragons following trends, or with songs like Believer trying and mostly failing to rip off AWOL Nation. But the real sinking blow for me, yeah, it comes in the songwriting and the lyrics. And look, even the Imagine Dragons songs that I like, they can feel a little bit ridiculously overwrought and kind of underwritten, taking one idea and then just kind of hammering it into the ground without really delving into some deeper real nuance, and you can kind of get away with that in arena rock. But while that was a problem on Night Visions and Smoke and Mirrors, it's utterly crippling for Evolve, as the song topics either span trying to find real direction, just plowing forward as a band despite adversaries that feel very nebulously defined, or your typical bad relationship song and trying to make it work together. In the former category, I can at least appreciate some high concept songwriting on Mouth of the River and maybe Whatever It Takes, where the writing can show a little bit more self-awareness, a little bit more interesting words in the vernacular at the peculiar place that Imagine Dragons holds right now in the mainstream. But I'm not sure it makes up for relationship songs like I'll Make It Up to You, where they say that the girl can't possibly understand the vices that follow a man, or how on Start Over, he never actually says the words I'm sorry to try and get this girl back. Owning your mistakes is very different than apologizing for them, dude. But you know what? It's indicative of something underlying all of the writing that really comes to the forefront on this album, and it's a messianic complex that's very willing to show Imagine Dragons go through so much pain and suffering in order to come out ahead. But I have to question where the source of this angst really is. It just feels frustratingly generic and directionless on Evolve. A lot of broad language, which again you can expect for the genre, but without a grounding influence to tie it back to earth, or even a sense of brighter triumph and coming out stronger. I guess there's thunder, but with the delivery, I'd argue it doesn't really quite earn being this magnanimous, and I also think that Avril Lavigne's Skater Boy pulled it off better. And regardless of all of that, when the album chooses an increasingly dour ending with Dancing in the Dark, it makes things even worse. It just feels like I've gone through an entire record and we didn't get any sort of positivity out of it. But look, again, I don't hate this, but if there's a record that felt more formless and forgettable this year, I'm not sure I've heard it. I like to say that Imagine Dragons sounds lost on this album, looking for that emotional through line or direction, but the truth is a lot worse. They've got a cohesive sound now, it's just thudding, overwrought, and not nearly tuneful enough to excuse lyrics this broadly sketched and kind of self-serving. For me, I'm thinking a 5 out of 10 and only barely a recommendation for Imagine Dragons fans and fans only. Otherwise, you're gonna hear them on the radio, so you might as well learn to tolerate them to some extent. But if we're looking for rock music on the Hot 100 in 2017, I think we could all do a fair bit better than this. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know I'm late to this, but if you wanted to buy this for some reason, links in the description below, and I got the pull up there for all you Imagine Dragon fans to say that you like this so much and that I'm so wrong. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you want to ensure that I cover these albums earlier, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you get to add records to my schedule. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.